Good morning. My name's Debbie Cafazzo. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees. My pronouns are she and her. We welcome all who are joining us today with a longing for community, the hope for peace, and those who are seeking justice. We're a diverse congregation that encourages everyone who comes through our door to find their own truth and beliefs. We invite all of you to join us in a search for meaning and community, guided by reason, respect for each other, and by love. We have a lot of people who come to us from near and far, so a special welcome to new friends joining us from wherever they are, and returning friends, of course. And I invite you to follow us on Facebook. If we're all living right, we are streaming live on Facebook even as we speak. And there will also be a recorded video version on our Facebook page later in the week. You can find announcements this week in our e-news, but let me give you some of the highlights. Today at 11:30, kids can join Nancy Slocum for Kids Chapel. The Infinite Cups host an evening of conversation and divination on Monday, November 16th at 7 p.m. For those of you who aren't familiar with cups, that is our sort of newly minted pagan affiliated group with our congregation. Tuesday nights, parents of children and youth can join Nancy Slocum for a parent drop-in on Zoom. Wednesday night, the Social Justice Committee leads a Race Matters discussion on white supremacy culture. Please register in advance for materials so you can prepare for the gathering. Erien Babcock is leading our worship service today. It'll be focused on John Murray and his legacy as the first Universalist Military Chaplain. Who knew? So be sure to also join us next Sunday, November 22nd, for our worship service to celebrate Erien's amazing service to our congregation and to give thanks for the gifts that she's brought to us this year. It's been a pretty incredible year. Couldn't have done it without you, Erien. And because she never quits, on Sunday, November 22nd, Erien will also be hosting a Star Wars chat for her last movie night with us. Some of these programs require registration, others are drop-in. You can get information by visiting our church calendar online at tahomauu.com, or you can look in the e-news. Many of you probably have heard from board members. We have all been furiously handwriting notes to everyone, asking for donations to sustain us during this time, since we did not have a formal pledge drive last spring. And I really hope that those of you who are able to can respond to those notes. And we want to thank everyone for their ongoing financial support, help support our staff and our programs. And let's join in worship now.
Good morning, I'm Erien Babcock, your ministerial intern, and I welcome you to today's very important service, at least to me personally. I am a veteran. I come from a long line of veterans on both sides of my family tree, all the way back to the American Revolution on my mother's side. So today's service is extremely important to me as we honor our veterans. You see, there are only 2 days a year that are specifically set aside for Americans to honor those who served our nation's people in military service. One is in May, that's Memorial Day. That one honors all of those who died in service. The second is to honor those who served and had the grace to come home alive. This is the path I wish to talk with you today. Those folks are folks who came home. They go about their work and they go about their lives after service like they never served. Others go about and they share stories. They display their service with pride. They have stickers. They wear the hats. They join the VFW. And there's a grace in these paths. They did something in service that was greater than themselves. And they did it for the American people, they did it for our Constitution, and they did it for American ideals. Now, too many of these people are still fighting battles you and I might not be able to understand or share. But as we visit our UU history today and our heritage around what it means to serve in our nation's military, I want you to keep these people in your hearts. It is my hope that those who are still battling stay to be honored on Veterans Day, and that they don't lose the fight and become someone we have to honor on Memorial Day because of these silent battles. Amen, Ashe, and blessed be.
We now come to the beginning of our service when we light the chalice. Nancy will be lighting the chalice at the church, and you are welcome to light your chalice at home and join me with the words that you will see in the chat if you don't know them already. We light this chalice with deep respect for the mystery and the holiness of life, in honor and gratitude for those who have gone before, with love and compassion for those who dwell among us, and with hope and faith for the generations to come.
Good morning. My name is Nancy Slocum. I am the Director of Religious Exploration for Children and Youth here at Tahoma Unitarian Universalist Congregation. It is just a great joy to be here with you all today. In way of an announcement, I want to remind everybody that in December we will be having our holiday pageant, and I am really hoping we get a lot of participation in our pageant this year. It will be a chance for us to tell this pandemic that we are not going to let it get in the way of our traditions. We're shifting what we're doing. We're doing our pageant via Zoom. It'll be interesting, I'm sure. But because of that, there's some things that are going to happen ahead of time, and we need people to sign up to do these things. Those of you who've been to our holiday service may remember we have a wonderful rendition of the 12 Days of Christmas that we sing, and we need participants who can be part of a recording, a video recording of that. No singing is required for this recording. We'll be recording your actions. That we're going to be recording on Sunday, December 6th at 2 in the afternoon. And if you want to sign up for this, there's a link to signups on our in our e-news and on our webpage. Also, we will be holding the pageant on December 20th during our service. It will be the Christmas story, the story of the birth of Jesus. And we need actors. I don't know that there's any speaking roles, or if there are, they're very short and can be read, but we need people who will sign up for that. And again, we have signups on our website for that, or just email me and I'll make sure you get hooked up with that. So I hope people will participate. I want these traditions to continue, even though we're all participating from home. And speaking of which, for those of you with grandparents who might love to see their kids involved in the pageant, they can log in from their homes, wherever they are in the world, either via our Zoom meeting or we'll be also streaming it live on Facebook. All right. So our time for all ages today. How many of you kids had a day off from school this week? And who knows what that day was for? It was for Veterans Day. It's a day that we take in our country to honor those people who have served in the armed forces, or you might hear it called the military. And the armed forces we have are the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Air Force, and the Coast Guard. And why do you think that we have a special day to honor them? Because my story talks about veterans and it talks about war, some of this is hard to talk about. But we as Unitarian Universalists know it's important to talk about the hard stuff so we can learn from it and we can work to make sure that these hard things don't happen again. So parents, I encourage you to offer opportunities for your kids to talk with you about this after church today. So when I was a teenager, I asked myself that question: why do we have a special day to honor veterans? Now, when I was growing up, the United States was involved in a war in Southeast Asia, in the country of Vietnam. And there were a lot of people who did not think that we should be sending our military to fight in that war. People had marches and demonstrations opposing the war. And I, as a young girl, a young teenager, would think to myself, well, war is bad. And I went on to think that we shouldn't even have a military. If war is bad, why would we have a military? And so the idea of honoring people who served in the military just didn't make any sense to me. Now, my father was a veteran, and when he was a young man, and I think I have a picture here of him that you can see him at about age 19, he was still a teenager when he joined the Army. This was in 1944, when our country was involved in another war, World War II. And it was called a world war because there was fighting going on all over in many different places in the world. And one of those places was in Europe. In Europe, the country of Germany had a leader named Adolf Hitler who had his army invade other countries to take them over, to make them part of Germany. And the United States, along with other countries, fought against the Germans to liberate or to free those countries. As I said, my father was just 19 years old. He was a student in college at St. Lawrence University in Northern New York when he left college to become a soldier. After training to be a soldier, he and the company he was in, they got on a ship and they traveled to France, where he joined the war. You know, when I was growing up, he never talked much about the war. I think it was too painful for him. But when I was 14, my parents and I made a trip to Europe. This was a little less than 30 years after World War II had ended. We traveled all over Europe by train, and we visited a whole lot of different countries. We visited Norway and Denmark, countries that I knew had been invaded by Germany during World War II. But there were a couple of places that we visited that really helped me to understand better what had gone on during World War II. After Norway and Denmark, we went to the city of Amsterdam, and we visited a place called the Anne Frank House. You may have heard of Anne Frank, but if you haven't, Anne Frank was a teenager, and she kept a diary, a book where she wrote in it every day, talking about what was going on in her life. Anne and her family were Jewish, a religion that we have talked about here in church. Not only was Hitler the leader of Germany and was he invading other countries, but there were groups of people that he didn't like. And he would have these people gathered up and put on trains and taken to what were called concentration camps, where people were forced to live in these concentration camps without much food, without medical care. And many of them died while they were there, either because they starved or they got sick or because they were killed. People who were Jewish, people who were Black, people with disabilities, people who were gay, and many others were all sent to concentration camps. You may have heard this called the Holocaust. As I said, Anne Frank and her family were Jewish, and a kind family they knew allowed them to hide with others in a secret room in their home. And they would have to stay very quiet so no one would hear them, because if they were caught, they would be sent away. And sadly, that's exactly what happened to them. Anne and most of her family died in concentration camps. Anne Frank's diary was found after the war, and it was published to help people understand what had gone on. People could read in this book about her life hiding. And the house where she hid was turned into a museum. My parents and I visited it when I was in Amsterdam at the age of 14, about the same age Anne Frank was when she lived with her family in that house. And I was deeply saddened to learn what had happened to her. And then from Amsterdam, we went to the city of Munich, Germany. One of the places we visited while there, it was the site of a former concentration camp, a place called Dachau. It too had been turned into a museum. I think because they wanted to make sure we never forgot what happened so that we'd make sure that it didn't happen again. And there I learned about how horrible those camps were and how millions of people died there. It was a really hard place to visit. I remember feeling physically sick after being there. And I began to understand why the United States and other countries decided to go to war to fight the Germans. Our trip took us to the city of Nancy in France, or otherwise pronounced Nancy, and yes, that's where my name comes from. My father had been in Nancy and the surrounding area when he was in the war, and he wanted to revisit the places he had been during the war. And from Nancy, we went to the country of Luxembourg, and then that's another place he had been during the war. And in Luxembourg, we were hosted by this wonderful man named Joseph. Joseph was part of a group that was interested in learning about the Battle of the Bulge, a huge battle in World War II that was fought in Luxembourg. It lasted for nearly a month and a half. He and his group that was studying with him, they were interested in learning everything they could about the Battle of the Bulge. And since my father had been there during that time, they wanted to meet him and learn all about it from him. So now Luxembourg is a tiny little country. It's about half the size of Pierce County. I was astonished to figure that out when I looked it up on Google yesterday. And when Luxembourg was invaded by the Germans, they couldn't do anything about it. They were so tiny, they were just too small. They didn't have the people to fight the big German army. And so they were taken over by the Germans. And the young men who lived in Luxembourg were forced to go into the German army and fight for the Germans, something they surely didn't want to do. And when I was there visiting 30 years later, I met people who had been forced to fight for the German army. And even though it was that many years later, they were still very angry about it. Joseph and the others took us around their country, and we visited the places my father had been during the war. And they also arranged for us to be greeted by mayors of different villages. And they would give speeches, and they'd give my mother flowers, and they'd give my father gifts. They wanted to thank my father for his service. I've always said that you would have thought that we were the family of General Patton, who had returned to Luxembourg, not some private first class, some soldier from the United States. They treated us like VIPs, very important people. And then I realized to them, my father was very important. If it were not for the thousands and thousands and thousands of soldiers who came to their country and fought for their freedom, they might have still been under German rule. Their gratitude to the Americans who crossed an ocean to fight for them was so deep. And I need notice that even our host Joseph's sons, two sons who are about my age, they held a deep appreciation for the US military, even though they had not been alive during the war. They had learned from their parents to be thankful for their freedom and for the people who sacrificed so much to give that to them. One of my strongest memories from the trip was when we went to visit the place where my father had been wounded. I knew that my father had been wounded in the war, but I'd never heard about what had happened and how he was wounded. It didn't happen when they were fighting, but rather it happened when he and two men were unloading a Jeep and a hand grenade fell. Do you know what a hand grenade is? It's an explosive device that you can hold in your hand and you can throw at someone, and when it explodes, it just breaks into lots of little tiny metal pieces, and the metal pieces are what injure people, maybe even kill people. Anyway, they were unloading this Jeep and a hand grenade fell off. My father said the last thing he remembers, he said, "What was that?" And then there was an explosion. He was standing fairly close to that explosion, so when the shrapnel came out, it mostly hit his legs and his feet. But the other two men who were further away took shrapnel in their bodies and in their heads, and they did not survive that explosion. The injuries my father received were bad enough that he had to leave Europe and go back to the United States, where he spent many months in a hospital. The effects of those injuries stayed with him his whole life. He had to wear special shoes that were made for him by the Army. I remember, like, once a year, he'd get a box from the Army with a new pair of shoes. But it also meant that he couldn't wear other shoes, maybe shoes for activities that have special shoes, like he couldn't go skiing, he couldn't go bowling. He couldn't put on skates. He couldn't play hockey the way he had before he entered the Army. Instead, he would announce the college hockey games on KSLU, the college radio station, but I'm sure he longed to be playing the sport. I remember his delight when he was older, he got an old pair of shoes fitted with cleats, so he finally had a pair of golf shoes. But the physical injuries he had were only part of it. For the rest of the life, he carried the memories of that war, where I'm sure he saw horrible, tragic things. He didn't talk about them much, but he carried them with him. My trip to Europe, and especially to Luxembourg, changed me. I saw the remnants of a war that took a great toll. The gratitude I witnessed from the people I met in Luxembourg reminded me that there are many sides to a story, and that it's important to look at all of them. The anti-war protests I witnessed in the United States were part of the story. And while I still believe war should be avoided at all costs, sometimes action does need to be taken. So on Veterans Day and all days, I'm grateful for the veterans, the people who served our country in the military. There's a happy ending to this story. Remember, I said my father spent many months in the hospital when he got back to the United States. Well, shortly after he got to the hospital, one of his nurses was a woman named Paula Lincoln. And because he was in the hospital for so long, they had a lot of time to get to know each other and to fall in love. My parents, the soldier Warren and the nurse Paula, were married for nearly 60 years. That's the story of my veteran. And that's our time for all ages. I will send you out with the words that we have every time when we end our time for all ages. I want you to listen carefully today to these words. Take them to heart. We hold you in our love as you go, as you go. May your heart be at peace as you go. To nurture the spark of your precious heart, we hold you in our love as you go. Take care.
We now come to the time in our service when we ask for your generosity. We come to this place to learn, to explore, to share. We come to this place for comfort, for caring, for understanding. We come to this place because it makes a difference in our lives in so many ways. This place is here because of our caring, our energy, and our funding. And as Debbie Cafazzo talked about earlier in the service, this is a critical time for us. We need the funding to be able to continue to maintain the church, pay our staff, and serve you, our congregants. So please reach into your heart, reach into your soul, and give as you can to support this organization and this spiritual place that means so much to all of us. We now dedicate our offering. We dedicate ourselves and our offerings to the work of this congregation, weaving a tapestry of love we call community, both within and beyond these walls.
As we enter a time of meditation, I want you to prepare that after the meditation, we will be honoring the veterans of our congregation by having them type their names into the chat. But first, let's sit in reflection. What is a veteran? Who are these folks? How do we care for them? What does it mean to love someone who is in the profession of the military? What does it mean to work toward peace while knowing you need to be prepared for war? Let's sit with this. Amen. Ashe. Bisheole. At this time, I invite you to become keyboard warriors of yourselves and type in the names. If you are a veteran, if you'd like to honor a veteran, and Bob and I will take turns reading their names while the beautifully kind Nancy lights the candles. I'll start with Carl George,
Clinton Peterson,
Thomas Pendleton,
Jeffrey Chandler,
oh, David, oh,
David Cerny,
Jeffrey Chandler,
Richard Oliver,
Charles Horn,
James Tarr,
Robert E. Hayes, and Bob. I gotta say Bob. Bless you.
Richard Watkins,
Larry, did we get Larry Soltoff?
Ronald Ray,
James Tarr,
Peggy Pearson, Randy Pearson, and Sheehan Hildreth.
Ronald Ray. Did we get Ronald? There's so many names. You guys are amazing. This is great.
Sam Tarienko, Joe DeHaas, Ron Smith,
John McPhee,
Cecile Nealon,
Dale Hackett,
John Doherty,
Dan Hale,
Bill Billis,
Jeff and Steve. Did we get Jeff and Steve? If we miss anyone, I'm sorry. This is like amazing.
Richard Kaufman, Jerry Stryker,
Chris G. Kaufman,
Ray Olson,
Edward Imberdson, Dwayne Liebig, Breck. Oh, Breck.
Aaron Wallace, Tom Howard, and Michael Howard.
Oh, Jim. Both Jims.
Gene Salzman,
Thomas Allen Gates,
Bud,
Perry Chandler,
Harold Sibley,
Mary Cosgrove,
William Van Nostrand,
Lou Loomis,
Paul Hedett, and Paul Hedett the third and fourth.
Chuck Hildebrand,
Pat and Neil Glinsky.
Gloria
Pardon me.
Hackett,
Charles Forshauer,
Tabitha Spriggs,
Larry Salzman,
Pat is it Soder?
Vince Andrews,
Tim Oliver,
Terry LeBrege, and Nathan LeBrege.
Gary Fink,
Richard Beals,
Tom Bookout,
Ben Hilton,
Colleen Dyer,
Alicia Todd,
Charles Stevenson, so many names, both living, those we honor as ancestors, and all those in between. We are graced at what these people brought to our lives, what they continue to bring to our lives. And I thank you all for participating in this honoring as we roll forward. Amen, Ashe, blessed be, and Bishe Ole.
Our reading for the day is George Washington and Religious Liberty by Paul Boyer. In the fight against bigotry in America, George Washington played a role second to none, both as a commander-in-chief of the Continental Army and as president. He used his immense prestige and influence to encourage mutual tolerance and goodwill among American Protestants, Catholics, Jews, and to create a climate of opinion in which every citizen shall, as he phrased it, quote, sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid, unquote. In private letters, in public statements, the first president voiced his utter detestation of intolerance, prejudice, and, as he said, quote, every species of religious persecution, unquote, and often expressed the hope that bigotry and superstition would be overcome by, quote, truth and reason, unquote, in the United States. The fact that Washington was firmly committed to religious liberty and freedom of conscience, like Jefferson and Madison, he looked upon the new nation as a pluralistic society in which people with varied religious persuasions and national backgrounds learn to live peacefully and rationally together, instead of resorting to force and violence. What was unique about the United States, in addition to cheapness of the land, quote unquote, was the existence of, quote, civil and religious liberty, unquote, which, quote, stand perhaps unrivaled by any civilized nation of the earth, unquote. In his general orders for April 18th, 1783, announcing the cessation of hostilities with Great Britain, he congratulated his soldiers, quote, of whatever condition they may be, for having assisted in protecting the rights of human nature and establishing an asylum for the poor and oppressed of all nations and religions, unquote. The, quote, bosom of America, unquote, that Washington declared a few months later was, quote, open to receive the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions, whom we shall welcome to a participation in all of our rights and privileges, unquote. When asking Tech Timon to secure a carpenter and a bricklayer for his Mount Vernon estate in 1784, he remarked, quote, if they are good workmen, they may be of Asia, Africa, or Europe. They may be Mohammedans, Jewish, Christians of any sect, or they may be atheists, unquote. He was, as John Bell pointed out in 1779, quote, a total stranger to religious prejudices which have so often excited Christians of one denomination to cut the throats of another, unquote.
Thank you, Bob, for that beautiful reading. Today, I'm going to talk about John Murray. I know you guys already have heard about John Murray, but let's pretend you haven't a little bit. Did you know that the first UU American military chaplain from, so the first chaplain in the military from our faith was the Reverend John Murray? Yes, the same Reverend John Murray who brought Universalist preaching to America. This John Murray, who arrived in 1770 from England to lose himself in the wilds of America after the death of his wife and child, he became our history with his preaching and with his Universalist teachings. This is our guy, right? Now, at the same time as his arrival in American history, there was a lot going on. The famous Boston Tea Party in December of 1773, the battles of Lexington and Concord in April of 1775. This time period in the wilds of America was fraught with so much unrest. And all of this unrest led to the founding of the Continental Army in June of 1775. Yes, you heard that right, 1775. Lots of dates. This is the point that the Reverend John Murray comes back into our American story. And he comes back via founding father George Washington that Bob was kind enough to read to us about. This is where George Washington's commitment, at least in his letters and his words, of religious freedom meets kind of the rubber in the road with action. Washington repeatedly said he wanted religious representation in his Continental Army to be reflected in the chaplains of many variety. Now, not everybody agreed with this thinking. And when word spread that the 3 Rhode Island regiments wanted Universalist John Murray as their chaplain, other chaplains freaked out. Mildly, we'll say they objected. However, when you read the letters, they were pretty cutting in how bad this was. It seems that Murray's religious ideas were too radical, that rabble-rouser him. And most of these arguments genuinely centered around the universalist idea of a rejection of hell. Like, seriously. Well, on September 10th of 1775, George Washington had dinner with his friend, Nathaniel Greene, who just so happened to bring along the Reverend John Murray to share the meal with Nathaniel Greene and George Washington. Now, at this point, we're gonna speculate some here. We're gonna insert some speculation because we were not in the, to quote a song, we were not in the room where it happened. But we can speculate that George Washington had dinner with John Murray and Nathaniel Greene to chat about the objections to John Murray's appointment as a chaplain and probably about faith in general. We don't know for sure. Again, total speculation. We know they had dinner September 10th. Well, rolling back into some facts here, we know that 7 days after this dinner, George Washington went on to appoint in his September 17th, 1775 general order that the Reverend John Murray is appointed, I'm quoting, is appointed as the chaplain to the Rhode Island regiments and is to be respected as such. He really wrote that in his general order. He had never done so before, and he never did so after. But those 7 words, and is to be respected as such, took Washington from merely saying he wanted religious freedom and diversity in his Continental Army to actually making it happen. To looking at the blistering letters of objection and saying they are not as important as the freedom of religion for the people who serve what wasn't even a country yet. This was brave and this was bold. It might ironically also be the most universalist and chaplainist phrase I have ever heard in my life. And is to be respected as such. Just think about those. I think about those words and what they're telling us. I think it's an empowering call for chaplaincy, for those of us who want religious diversity, for those of us who uphold freedom. Think about it. Think about it. Let's take a moment. I see this as the truth behind religious freedom in action and not just words on a page. This is a living reality of our Universalist history and our military history. These are the people who serve those veterans, who serve those we honor on Memorial Day, that they need to be diverse and that we don't have to believe the same to respect each other. This is real freedom going forward. It really is. This is the legacy that all military chaplains and regular chaplains in hospital settings live. This is our rally cry. This is an excellent intersection of not just our faith, but military chaplaincy. We're doing the same job in so many ways. Those who do this work Let others tell them what they believe. And then the chaplain reflects that back to them. That is respecting them as such. That is respecting them as such. Military chaplains and chaplains are not supposed to convert. They are not supposed to evangelize, at least the good ones. And this is where UU chaplains happen to be a gift. This is a legacy of our Universalist heritage. The primary mission in Air Force chaplains, as outlined in their regulations, and we get a little boring for a second, is to provide religious support and spiritual care for all airmen and their families, and to assist in veteran care. This is guaranteed by their constitutional right to the free exercise of religion. In this capacity, they also have the protections of full confidentiality from chaplains and chaplains' assistants and chaplain staff when folks come to them for problems. That is the most important grace, and it is to be respected as such. This is living universalism. This matters. As someone whose entire life is folded into and around the military, I have to concede this is who I am. I hold this to be so true. I knew what a chaplain was as a small child. I remember when my dad's chaplain was a rabbi, and he still did Christmas stuff with us because he respected my dad. He respected me as a child to get to choose my own religious way. That is a blessing. That is truth. That's reality. That's my calling. I know that that's been hard for many people in UU spaces to understand, but this is what I want to do. I want to live what John Murray did. I want to defend and protect what George Washington upheld as what it meant to be religious freedom in America. These are our ancestors. These are our ancestors of country. These are our ancestors of faith. And they left us a legacy of hard work that calls for us to be better in the world and to be better listeners. And when we have veterans who walk into our spaces, to tell them that they are loved, that it doesn't matter if they're a veteran or not a veteran, that they are loved and they are worthy of our hugs. That we embrace all people, that we embrace that diversity. And that, like you, the listener, are to be respected as such. I thank you for listening to me. I appreciate all of you. And to my veterans who are here today, know that I hold you in my heart and I pray for you every day. And to my non-veterans, know that I love you as well. Amen. Ashe. Bishe Ole. As we set our intention, I don't know if something spoke to you today, if it was words, if it was light, if it was Nancy's amazing story that had me tearing up, or Bob's wonderful reading in his amazing uniform. But I'd like you to carry whatever it is that spoke to you so that you may live out your week a little bit better, a little bit stronger, a little bit wiser. And I thank you for that. I also want to note, look at that beautiful bowl of all those lights of our veterans. So please, please, please be graced in the world. Amen. For our closing words today, I have a poem from a Vietnam veteran who was a chaplain's assistant. His name is Jim Olson, and he was from Minnesota. And it's November 3rd, 1970, the day I came home from Vietnam. I turned back for one last look as I boarded the plane. It was a place I was sure I would never see again. Thankfully, I was wrong. But at the time, I was just so happy to be leaving alive. I expected a rowdy flight home. As at liftoff, there was a rousing cheer, catapulting us forward. GIs laughed and pinned their purple hearts to the uniforms of smiling flight attendants. After a few moments of backslapping, the plane went silent. I looked back at those behind me, quiet faces, some tear-stained faces. After a gasp of exuberance, they had quickly drawn back into themselves. I couldn't tell if they were looking backward or forward, but they had quietly drifted somewhere. We recrossed the international date line, regaining those hours we had lost. For me, a bonus. More time to spend with my loved ones. For those extra hours in others would extend the pain of remembrance and the frustration of readjustment. For some, this was indeed a freedom bird, but for many, they were being carried home to a new kind of prison. Amen and blessed be.
We now close our service with the extinguishment of our chalice. You can join with me if you don't know the words, they're in the chat. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.